My name is Travis, and I've worked security for close to 10 years. I'm used to the dark, the quiet, the echoes bouncing off concrete walls. But what happened that night, in that warehouse in Omaha? That changed everything. That Wednesday night started out just like any other shift. I had the inside patrol, while Rick, my partner, stayed outside keeping an eye on the perimeter from his truck. Rick was the kind of guy who'd crack a joke about anything. Nothing rattled him. I figured if there was ever a night something happened, we'd be fine with Rick around. He'd probably just laugh it off. The warehouse itself was huge. Rows and rows of equipment, everything from high-end computers to sensitive machinery. This place had it all, stacked up high and packed tight. It's no wonder they needed 2 guards at night. The job was straightforward: walk the aisles, check for any suspicious movement, listen for anything out of the ordinary. I thought I'd seen it all over the years: break-ins, kids sneaking in for a thrill, even the occasional homeless person looking for a place to crash. But that night was different. It must have been around 2 in the morning. I was doing my rounds, walking down the main aisle between 2 towering stacks of crates and pallets. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought I was just tired, seeing things. But as I squinted, I realized it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. There, barely visible, peeking out from behind a row of crates near the back of the aisle, was something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, but then I saw it more clearly. It was white, like a face, or something resembling a face. The skin, or whatever it was, looked almost sickly, translucent in the dim light. Just a pale, twisted shape hovering there, peeking at me from the darkness. I froze, my flashlight pointed directly at it, but the light didn't make it disappear. I felt a chill run down my spine. I took a step closer, trying to convince myself that it was just my eyes playing tricks. But as I took that step, the face, it slipped away, almost like it ducked back behind the crates. My heart was racing. I mean, what could it have been? Another person? But who would be in here, hiding? My mind ran through all the possibilities. An intruder, some kind of mannequin that had been left behind, but none of it made sense. I tried calling out, hoping maybe if someone was there, they'd show themselves. Hello? Who's there? My voice echoed off the concrete and metal shelves. Nothing. Not a single sound. Just the distant hum of the warehouse lights. I decided to check the security cameras. I practically sprinted over to the control room and rewound the footage for the last few minutes, focusing on the aisle where I'd seen that thing. Sure enough, there it was on the screen. The pale, sickly face, peeking from behind the crates. I felt a lump in my throat as I watched it slip back into the shadows. I grabbed my radio and called Rick, telling him to get inside. Rick sounded confused but agreed to meet me in the main aisle. As I waited, I felt like the walls of that warehouse were closing in on me. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. When Rick got there, I explained what I'd seen. He chuckled at first, but as he looked at my face, he knew I wasn't joking. All right, he said, grabbing his flashlight. Let's go take a look. We walked down the main aisle together, moving slowly, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The place felt colder than usual, and there was this faint smell in the air. It was hard to place, but it reminded me of something rotten, something dead. The smell got stronger as we approached the area where I'd seen the face. Rick wrinkled his nose. You smell that? Yeah, I whispered, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. And then we found it. Tucked between 2 stacks of crates was a large wooden box. It looked old, out of place among the newer equipment around it. The smell was coming from there. Rick and I exchanged a glance. Every part of me wanted to turn around, to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't. I had to know. We approached the box, and Rick knelt down, gripping the edges of the lid. I held my breath as he pried it open. Inside was a sight I'll never forget. A body lay crumpled within, slumped over in a sickening pool of dried blood. But it wasn't just any body, this one was missing its head. The jagged wound at the neck looked fresh, like it had been done not too long ago. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, barely keeping myself from vomiting. Rick stood there, staring at the gruesome sight, his face pale. "What the hell, Travis? What is this?" I fumbled for my radio and called the police. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. We backed away from the box, neither of us daring to take our eyes off it, as if the body might sit up at any moment. The wait for the police felt like an eternity. Every sound, every shadow seemed alive, lurking just beyond the range of our flashlights. I kept glancing down the aisle, half expecting to see that pale face again. When the police finally arrived, they sealed off the area, surrounding the warehouse with yellow tape. The investigators moved in quickly, documenting the scene and questioning us about what had happened. I explained everything, how I'd seen that face, how we'd followed the smell to the box. They were skeptical at first, but when they reviewed the footage, they saw it too, the same pale face, watching from the shadows. The officers pulled me aside and asked if I'd noticed anything strange the night before, anything that might explain what was happening. I hadn't, but then one of the techs reviewing the footage came over, looking spooked. He explained that there was a 3-hour gap in the recordings from the previous night. The cameras had just stopped, and there was no explanation for it. I felt a shiver go down my spine as I listened to the officers talk. They had no leads, no reason why the cameras would go dark like that. And that face, it kept haunting me. I kept replaying it in my mind, that sickly, pale face watching me from the shadows. I tried telling myself it was just some sick joke, maybe a setup, but deep down, I knew it was something else. Something that didn't belong in this world. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that pale face, hovering just out of sight. I even left Omaha for a while, thinking maybe distance would help. But it didn't. The nightmares followed me, the memory of that face etched into my mind. I don't work security anymore. I can't bring myself to step foot into another warehouse, let alone in the dark. I still don't know what I saw that night, if it was the killer hiding in the shadows or something far worse. And honestly, I don't think I ever want to know. All I know is that whatever it was real. Late last fall, when the air had started getting that biting chill, I moved back to my small hometown for a bit. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened. A single main street, a handful of shops that closed by 9, and locals who knew everyone else's business. I was staying in my childhood home, sharing it with my older sister, Hannah, though she was almost always away for work. So, most nights, it was just me alone in that single-story house, the quiet and creaky kind that gets even quieter after the sun goes down. My days had a routine. I'd come home from work, change into running gear, and head out for a jog. Running at night was one of the few things that gave me a sense of freedom in that sleepy town. The streets were always deserted, and the chill of the evening air seemed to clear my head like nothing else. But something strange happened one night, something that made me question whether I was as alone in my quiet life as I thought. It started out like any other evening. I'd just finished my usual route and was cooling down, walking the last stretch back to my house. That's when I noticed it, a white truck parked on the other side of the street. It struck me as odd because our neighborhood hardly ever saw any unfamiliar cars, let alone at night. It wasn't just parked in front of anyone's house, it was parked directly across from mine. I shrugged it off, though, figuring maybe it was a new neighbor or someone visiting a friend. I went inside, locked up, and tried to ignore the slight unease prickling at the back of my neck. Later that night, as I lay in bed trying to drift off, I heard a faint noise from outside. I couldn't quite place it, a kind of scraping sound, followed by a dull thump. The rational part of me brushed it off as the neighbors, maybe one of their kids sneaking around past bedtime. But the longer I lay there, the harder it was to ignore. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I fell asleep, dismissing it as the wind or some other innocent explanation. The next day, the truck was gone. I didn't think too much of it, but there was a sense of relief in seeing the empty street again. Things went back to normal, and I went about my day, eventually meeting up with a few friends for dinner that night. By the time I got back home, it was late, well past midnight, and I was exhausted. My street was empty, quiet under the glow of a single street lamp. But then, as I walked up my driveway, my stomach dropped. The white truck was back. It was parked right across from my house, in the exact same spot as before. It looked identical, down to a slight rust patch on the side and a cracked tail light. I remember standing there for a moment, staring at it, feeling a weird sense of dread pooling in my stomach. But again, I pushed it aside. "It's just a coincidence," I told myself. "You're just tired, imagining things." I headed inside, locked the door, and climbed into bed, but the unease from seeing that truck parked outside lingered. That night, just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. This time, it was louder, a kind of shuffling, almost like someone was brushing against the outside walls of the house. My heart started to pound, and I tried to convince myself it was an animal, or the house settling. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the unmistakable sound of a doorknob rattling. The back door. I held my breath, straining to hear any other noises, when I heard a soft, hollow thud coming from inside the walls. It was faint but steady, like someone tapping or, no, more like someone trying to break through from inside. I felt a surge of adrenaline and grabbed my phone, thinking of calling Hannah, but she was miles away. I was on my own. I crept through the house as quietly as I could, trying to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to be coming from somewhere low, near the ground, like the crawl space under the house. When I got to the crawl space entrance, my stomach twisted. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see that the lock was broken, the metal twisted and mangled like someone had forced it open. I swallowed, crouched down, and against every instinct, leaned in close to the opening, squinting into the darkness. For a second, everything was silent. Then, faintly, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, shuffling footsteps coming toward me. I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. There was someone under my house. Panicked, I slammed the crawl space door shut and ran back inside, bolting every door and window I could think of. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911, trying to explain the situation to the dispatcher without sounding like a complete lunatic. They assured me they'd send someone over and told me to stay on the line. I paced the house, clutching the phone, every nerve on edge as I waited for the police to arrive. When they finally showed up, 2 officers checked the crawl space. They found signs that someone had been under there, footprints in the dirt, and more disturbingly, marks on the beams beneath the house, like someone had been cutting into them. The officer said it looked like whoever it was had been trying to carve a way up into the floor of the house itself. The thought of someone crawling around beneath me, listening, waiting, it made my skin crawl. I told them about the white truck, and they said they'd keep an eye out, though without a license plate or more information, there wasn't much they could do. They reassured me they'd patrol the area, but they left without any real answers. I was shaken, but I thought maybe this would be enough to scare off whoever it was. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly glancing out the windows, waiting for any sign of that truck. But it didn't come back, at least not right away. For a few days, I started to feel a bit of relief, thinking maybe it was over, that the person had been scared off. I even went back to my nightly runs, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. But one night, just as I was getting home from work, I spotted it again. That same white truck, parked just down the street this time, as if it were watching from a distance. It felt like a slap to the face, the realization that whoever was out there hadn't given up. This time, I didn't ignore it. I called the police again, gave them a detailed description, and told them everything that had happened. They promised they'd look into it, but they never managed to catch the truck, or whoever had been driving it. In the end, the truck disappeared for good after a few more nights of lurking. Maybe they'd figured out the police were onto them, or maybe they just decided it wasn't worth the risk. But the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of knowing that someone had been under my house, inches from where I slept. It started with a tip from Mike. He's the kind of guy who always knows about the weird places, the creepy spots that no one dares to go to. The kind of places people whisper about in bars, or you hear rumors of but never want to confirm. He was always talking about the warehouse. Said it was an old furniture store, closed down for years, now just sitting there rotting, full of secrets. Or at least that's what people said. Some claimed it was abandoned, others said it had been a spot for illegal activity, the kind of place you just didn't want to go near. But Mike insisted there was something more, something darker hidden inside. Me, I wasn't sure about it at first. We'd done some crazy things before, ghost hunts, stupid dares, but this? It felt different. Still, curiosity got the better of me. So, one night we decided to check it out. I was with Mike, of course, and then there was Danny. Danny and I had known each other since high school, and we had this bond, something about both of us always being the more adventurous, the ones who pushed the limits. Mike had always been the instigator, the one who would suggest the insane ideas, but Danny and I were always the ones who ended up tagging along. We met up at Walgreens, just down the road from the warehouse. It was close enough to walk, but far enough that if anything went wrong, we'd be far enough from help. The usual spot, the usual vibe, a little too much time on our hands, too much adrenaline pumping in our veins. It was late, around 10:30 or so, and the parking lot outside Walgreens was nearly empty, save for a few cars parked under the dim lights. The air had a cool bite to it, and I remember how the breeze felt on my skin, sharp, like it was trying to warn me. Mike had his usual cocky grin, a little too wide for comfort, and Danny seemed a little off, but I figured it was just nerves. The way Mike talked about this place had Danny uneasy. "Let's get this over with," Danny muttered, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. Mike didn't pay him any attention. "Come on, don't tell me you're scared." Danny shot him a look. "I'm not scared. I just don't have a good feeling about this." I didn't say anything. Truth be told, I didn't either. There was something off about the whole thing, something I couldn't quite place, but we'd made the decision, and there was no backing out now. We walked down the street, the pavement cracked beneath our feet. The light from the Walgreens sign flickered as we passed, casting an eerie glow over the abandoned storefronts. I remember glancing up at the dark sky, the moon barely visible behind the thick clouds, and how still everything seemed. It was quiet, too quiet. When we finally reached the warehouse, I had to admit, it looked worse than I'd imagined. The building was enormous, towering above us, its windows dark, almost as if it was watching us. The large sign that used to say, "Furniture Emporium," was rusted and half fallen off, leaving only a few letters to dangle in the wind. The place was covered in grime and overgrown weeds, the kind of neglect that felt wrong. The door was locked, as we expected, but there was a gap in the back wall, just large enough for us to squeeze through. Mike, being the leader of the pack, was the first to crawl through, followed by Danny. I hesitated for just a moment, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but then I followed. Inside was something else entirely. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of rot and dust. It was pitch black, so dark that even our flashlights barely made a dent in the gloom. The floor was littered with debris, old furniture, shattered glass, and broken pieces of what I can only assume were once grand display pieces. But what made my stomach twist wasn't the mess, it was the graffiti. There were symbols on the walls, dark and twisted. I'm not talking about the typical spray paint nonsense. These were different. There were words I couldn't read, crosses drawn upside down, and the numbers 666, repeated over and over again, like some sort of curse. It felt like the walls themselves were screaming, even though no sound was coming from them. The place felt wrong. Every inch of it. The kind of wrong you feel deep in your gut. We didn't say anything at first. We just kept walking through the dark, each of us with our flashlights scanning over the walls, trying to make sense of the madness. Then we saw the stairs. There was blood, dark, dried blood, on the steps leading up to a second level. The air grew colder as we moved closer, and that's when we saw the rope. A thick, frayed piece of rope hanging from the rafters above, tied in a loop. I don't know how long it had been there, but the sight of it sent a chill through my entire body. Danny was the first to say something. "We need to go." I nodded, but it felt like we were already too deep in. We had to know what else was in here. What else this place was hiding. But just as we turned to leave, something caught my eye. Something from the corner of the room, something small and metallic. I stepped closer cautiously. It was a box, an old, rusted box, barely visible in the dark. I crouched down, feeling the unease growing in my chest. Mike stood behind me, whispering for me to leave it alone, but I had to know. I reached for it, and when I opened it, I immediately regretted it. Inside was a collection of small objects, coins, jewelry, and scraps of paper. But it was what was on the paper that froze my blood. It was a drawing, a crude, childish drawing of a person with a noose around their neck. And underneath, in jagged, frantic writing, "The end is near." That's when I knew. This place wasn't just abandoned. It wasn't just a forgotten relic of some old furniture store. This place had been used. And it was still being used. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. "We need to get out. Now." We turned, but just as we started to head for the back entrance, something changed. I don't know how to describe it. It was like the air thickened, the walls seemed to press in closer. That's when Mike's phone rang. It was Jim, our friend who had been too scared to come with us. He was panting, his voice shaking. "You guys, you're not alone in there." I froze, my blood running cold. I could hear the tremor in his voice, and I knew he wasn't joking. "Jim, what are you talking about?" Mike asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause on the other end, then Jim's voice came through again, trembling. "There's someone out there. 2 trucks, a white one and a black one. They're parked in front of the warehouse. They've been watching you." I felt my stomach drop, and before I could process it, I heard the sound of an engine revving outside. A white truck, just like Jim had described, came speeding down the dirt road toward us, its headlights blinding as it rushed toward the entrance. My heart nearly stopped. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, and we ran. We didn't look back. We just ran, through the darkness, through the fear, until we were back at the Walgreens parking lot, breathless and terrified. But as we reached the safety of the lights, we saw the black truck parked nearby, its engine still running. Whoever they were, they didn't follow us, but I'm sure they were waiting for us to slip up. We never went back. None of us. And to this day, I don't know what those trucks were about or who was in them. But I know one thing for sure, that warehouse wasn't abandoned. Not by a long shot. It was a quiet weekend at home, too quiet actually. My parents were out of town for a couple of days, leaving me to fend for myself. They trusted me enough, or maybe they just didn't mind the silence of the house when I was around. Either way, I was 14, a bit more independent than most kids my age, and thought I had things under control. That Saturday night, I went out with my friends, Jack, Jeremy, and Caleb. We did what any typical group of teenage boys would do. We wandered around the town, hung out by the park, and ended up at a corner store to grab some snacks. By the time we were heading home, the streets were empty, the kind of empty that felt unnatural. I remember walking down the sidewalk, my hands in my hoodie pockets, the cold wind whipping through the trees. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the world felt too quiet, almost suffocatingly so. That's when I noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, just behind me, cruising slowly down the road. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was someone else out late, or maybe it was a car just passing by. But as I walked on, I noticed it was matching my pace. I picked up my speed. I wasn't paranoid, but that car kept getting closer. And then, the lights flashed. The headlights blinked on and off, like someone was trying to get my attention. I thought about running, but I didn't want to panic. I kept walking, trying to act normal. I was almost home, anyway. The car slowed down even more as I turned onto my street, and that's when the real panic kicked in. I started running. I didn't care how stupid it looked, I just wanted to get inside the house. The sidewalk stretched endlessly, but I finally reached my front door. I slammed it shut behind me, panting, my heart racing. I thought I was safe. But the moment I stepped into the hallway, I heard the sound of brakes screeching outside. I froze. The car had stopped. I peeked through the curtains. The car was sitting in front of the house. My heart sank into my stomach. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it didn't go away. A few seconds later, the sound of footsteps echoed in the stillness. I slowly backed away from the window. I couldn't breathe. I heard the doorbell ring, once, twice, 3 times. Then, more knocking, sharp, quick knocks that sent chills down my spine. Someone was outside, someone I didn't know. I didn't know what to do. My parents were hundreds of miles away, and I was all alone. I didn't have any older siblings to call, just me. I tried calling my mom, but the phone line was dead, just like my courage. I couldn't even move. I bolted for their bedroom, locking myself inside the closet. My mind raced. Was this some sort of prank? Was it someone from school playing a cruel joke? The knocking stopped, but only for a moment. I heard the sound of someone moving around outside, then the distinct thud of a door slamming. And then, something even worse. The sound of footsteps inside the house. I stayed frozen in the dark, every muscle tense. Was it someone who had broken in? What if they knew I was here? My mind was spiraling, the fear overwhelming me. The door to my parents' room creaked, and then, louder, someone pounded on the door. That was it. I could feel the sweat running down my back, cold and sticky. My pulse pounded in my ears. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. My voice barely worked as I whispered into the phone. 911, what's your emergency? I think someone's in my house, I said, barely above a whisper. I'm alone, please help. Stay calm, the dispatcher said, and her voice sounded like a distant echo. We're sending officers over right now. Stay on the line with me. I hung up, trying to be as quiet as possible. I could hear muffled voices outside my parents' room. Then came the sound of something breaking. It was like the glass of the back door shattering, followed by more steps, heavier, louder. I held my breath. I don't know how much time passed before the door was kicked in. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. The intruder was close. Too close. My body was shaking uncontrollably. Suddenly, I heard a new sound, the voice of a man, yelling from the street outside. Hey! You need to get out of there! There's someone in your house! I froze. What? Who was that? I couldn't make sense of it. But then I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. It was real. Help was coming. The man outside continued to shout. Get out of there now! There's a guy in your house. I saw him come in through the back door. I didn't know whether to trust him. He didn't sound like he was lying, but how did he know what was going on inside? My head was spinning. All I could do was wait. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, I heard the sound of the front door crashing open. The man outside was yelling something, but I couldn't hear it clearly. I was too scared to move. Then, finally, an officer's voice shouted from the bottom of the stairs. Police! Stay where you are! There were several more shouts and the sound of boots running up the stairs. Moments later, I heard a door swing open. I didn't dare move, just stayed huddled in the closet, praying for safety. It felt like forever before the officers found me. They told me to come out, and I finally did, trembling. As I walked out of the closet, one of the officers was talking to the man outside. The officer turned to me with a serious expression. Are you all right? He asked gently. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The man outside stepped closer, and to my surprise, he didn't look threatening. He was older, maybe in his 30s, with a weathered face. You're lucky. he said, looking at me. "I saw the guy following you, and I knew something wasn't right. I stayed back, but I kept an eye on him. When he came around the back of your house and smashed the window to get in, I knew I had to act. I couldn't believe it. He was watching the whole time. I thought he was just some random guy, but he wasn't. He was trying to help." The police checked the house, and they found that the man had tried to break in through the back window. They said he didn't seem interested in stealing anything. His focus was on me, not the valuables in the house. That's when things got real scary. He had been following me for a reason. Thankfully, the police arrested the man, and I never saw him again. But the worst part of the whole night wasn't just the break-in. It was the realization that someone had been watching me. Waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The sound of the man's voice, the loud thudding of his steps, those sounds stayed with me, even when the house was quiet again. The next morning, my parents came home. They were furious and scared at the same time, but I could barely speak about what happened. My mind was still stuck in the events of the night. As for the man who had saved me, I don't know what happened to him. The police said he was just a good Samaritan, but I'll never forget him either. I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness, or the terror of knowing someone had been so close. And to this day, I still wonder, what if he hadn't been there? What if I hadn't noticed the car following me? Would I have been alone with that man in my house? I don't want to know. It all started a couple of years ago, when I was working as an event coordinator for a small but growing music company. We specialized in organizing high-energy parties and live events at rented venues, usually warehouses or old industrial spaces. It was a fast-paced job, and I thrived in the chaos of it all. But there's one event I'll never forget. One that still haunts me to this day. It all happened at a massive warehouse just outside of town, tucked away in a less-than-friendly neighborhood. I had been assigned to manage an event over a weekend. The plan was simple: host a 2-day rave, Friday and Saturday, with an amazing lineup of local DJs and some serious light shows. The venue was an old warehouse, like so many of the places we used for our events. The size of it was overwhelming: 2 floors, a maze of rooms, industrial pipes hanging from the ceilings, and just an endless expanse of concrete and steel. It felt like it could have been a horror movie set, and I guess in hindsight, it kind of was. I got there on Friday morning, hours before the event started, with my best friend and assistant, Jack. We had a team of people to help set up, but we were still mostly in charge of making sure everything ran smoothly. We were checking the lighting rig, the sound system, and making sure the food and drink areas were ready. But as we started to test the equipment, something odd happened. The power to the back section of the warehouse started flickering, then went completely out. Jack and I spent a good while trying to troubleshoot, but we couldn't figure out what was going on. The lights would blink on for a second, then shut off again, like something was interfering with the electricity. After what felt like hours of frustration, I decided it was time to call the landlord, a guy named Carter. He was one of those guys who was always calm and collected, sometimes to the point where it was almost unsettling. I rang him up, explaining the issue. His response was the same as always. "Just head down to the basement, check the electrical panel. That should fix it." Now, I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was just a typical issue with old wiring or maybe a tripped breaker. But Jack and I both knew this warehouse well. It wasn't exactly up to code, and I've always had this weird feeling when I had to go down to the basement. But this time, I had no choice. I told Jack to stay upstairs and keep an eye on the crew while I went down to the basement to check the panel. The stairs creaked as I descended into the dimly lit space. There was a heavy, musty smell in the air, like the kind of place you wouldn't want to breathe too deeply in. I switched on the basement light, and for a second, everything seemed normal. The room was full of old equipment, empty crates, and leftover junk that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The electrical panel was at the far end of the room, near a small door that led into a much darker corner. As I approached the panel, that's when I heard it, a faint, high-pitched hum coming from the other side of the room. It was barely audible, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't the sound of machinery or equipment running. It sounded off. Like static. Rattling. Something unsettling. I froze for a moment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was strange because the rest of the basement was eerily quiet, and I couldn't remember ever hearing that noise before. I stepped toward the source, the hum growing louder the closer I got to a small, dark room at the far corner of the basement. The door was cracked open just a little, and I could see a faint red glow coming from within. It flickered in time with the hum, like a malfunctioning light. Now, I know I should have just turned around and gone back upstairs, but I'm stubborn, and at the time, I thought it was just a weird glitch. So I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. There, in the far corner of the room, was a small, cheap red light hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows across the space. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. No, what caught my attention was the figure sitting in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a piece of discarded furniture or some old prop. But then I saw it move. The figure was hunched, with wild, unkempt hair that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its head was tilted slightly back, and its wide eyes were staring at me. Its lips were stretched into a half-smile, frozen in a grotesque expression. There was something about the way it looked at me that felt wrong. The eyes were too wide, too vacant. It was as though it wasn't just looking at me, but waiting for something. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. The figure slowly lifted a hand and waved at me, the motion jerky and unnatural, as if it was trying to beckon me closer. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I didn't say a word, just backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure. The hum in the room got louder, more distorted, and I could feel my stomach twist with unease. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, I managed to tear my eyes away from that figure and run out of the room. I slammed the door behind me, my breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, I just stood in the dark basement, trying to gather myself, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. But I didn't want answers, not then. I called Carter. My voice was shaky, and I could barely get the words out. I told him that something was wrong down there, that I'd seen something strange in the basement. I expected him to react, to ask questions, maybe even to come down himself. But he didn't. He was so calm. Almost too calm. "That's just a motion sensor," he said. "Probably just a malfunction. There's nothing to worry about. It's an old security system. Probably just a glitch. Don't worry about it." His voice was flat, almost robotic. And something about that response, that cold indifference, made my skin crawl. I hung up on him. I didn't want to take any chances. I ran back upstairs and grabbed Jack. I couldn't explain everything to him. There wasn't time, and honestly, I didn't want to. I just told him that we were leaving, that something felt wrong, and that I wasn't going to stay another minute in that place. We packed up quickly, throwing everything into the van, my hands shaking. The crew was confused, but I didn't care. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. I didn't even bother locking the doors when we left. We just drove away, leaving the warehouse behind us. I never went back to that place. And I never will.